Good evening. On behalf of the director, I would like to welcome all of you to the Bard Graduate Center, those of you here on West 86th Street, and those of you around the corner or around the world watching the live stream on the web. Jakob Burckhardt, in so many ways the founding father of what we do here at the Bard Graduate Center, put the Conservation Act at the heart of the historical operation. In his guidebook to Italian art, he explained, and I quote, that the observer must develop in himself this faculty of restoring, without which ancient ruins would seem but unformed remains. One must, looking at a fragment, divine the whole, learn to reconstitute it, and not to demand of the remains an immediate impression, since its beauty is not complete, but by reflection. For Burckhardt, then, the act of making whole is a task for the head as it is for the hand, the act of conserving the province of the trained imagination as much as that of the trained memory. Talking about imagination 3 decades later, we're now in 1887, he explained that, and I quote again, certain researchers better explain the means employed in the art of the past, while I put more emphasis on the intentions which were at the origin of that art. Just as the Conservation Act has too infrequently been seen as part of the imaginative apparatus of all good scholarship, the study of techniques has too infrequently been hitched to that of intentions or large-scale explanation. With the support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Cultures of Conservation, a 5-year curricular initiative at the Bard Graduate Center, aims to bring into a single perspective the visions of conservators and humanities professors. The Conservation Conversations, of which tonight's is the first, will pair a professor and a conservator on a single topic, showing the meaningfulness of their different starting points, but also the possibilities for convergence and fruitful exchange. And the format will follow the function. Each speaker will present for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there will be a conversation between the two into which you and your questions may be thrown. Subsequent conversations on November 12th will take on the subject of fashion and conservation. On February 11th, the question of time and conservation. And on April 24th, the feature will be, as we will do every year, a case study in an existing collaboration between a conservator and a professor. Tonight's topic is connoisseurship. And our speakers are David Bomford and Carlo Ginsberg. David Bomford is now Director of Conservation at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Pure Chemistry and his Master's of Science in Organometallic Chemistry from the University of Sussex. Prior to his current position, David Bomford was Acting Director of the J. Paul Getty Museum, Assistant Restorer, Senior Restorer, and Head of the Registrar's Office and Art Handling Department at the National Gallery in London. His numerous curatorial and publication projects include exhibits and catalogs at the National Gallery and the whole Art in the Making series, beginning with Rembrandt in 1988, continuing through Italian painting before 1400, Impressionism, underdrawings and Renaissance paintings, and Degas, concluding in 2004. David Bomford was also Slade Professor at Oxford in 1996-97, the first conservator to hold this appointment. Our second speaker this evening, Carlo Ginsberg, needs little introduction. He was most recently teaching at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa, and before that was Franklin D. Murphy Professor of Italian Renaissance Studies at UCLA. He is most famous, perhaps, for The Cheese and the Worms, the Cosmos of the 16th Century Miller, one of the great historical works of the 20th century, and then a series of other examinations of witchcraft and inquisitors, ecstasies The Night Walkers, and then a series of essays on historical method, Clues, Myths, and Historical Method, 1989. The Menachem Stern Lectures, published as History, Rhetoric, and Proof in 1999. No Island is an Island, 4 Glances at English Literature in a World Perspective, 2000. Wooden Eyes, 9 Reflections on Distance, 2001. And most recently, Threads and Traces, True, False, Fictive, published by the University of California Press in 2012. He has been the recipient of the A.B. Warburg Prize for Achievement in the Humanities, the Humboldt Forschungspreis, and the Balzan Prize for the History of Europe, 1400 to 1700. And now it's my pleasure to present the first of our speakers, David Bomford.
Thank you, Peter, very much. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. It's a great pleasure to be here for the first of these conversations and to be speaking on the same platform as Carlo. I'm going to be talking this evening about Rembrandt, and I've chosen to speak about Rembrandt Scholarship because it seems to me that everything one might wish to say about connoisseurship, ancient and modern, can be refracted through that particular prism. Here we have one of the iconic figures of Western art, admired, studied, analysed and debated down the generations by some of the greatest art historians of their age. Here is the archetypal, romantic, moody genius whose works have always fetched record prices on the art market, a must-have for all the most dazzling art collections of the world. A painter with a seemingly instantly recognisable style, but over whose oeuvre hang confusion and perpetual question marks, put there by the plethora of pastiches, copies, and workshop variants that jostle for attention. Rembrandt is the most imitated painter in history. Rembrandt's scholarship is connoisseurship's perfect storm. Things might have been very different if the artist had followed the advice of his early patron, Constantin Huygens. Writing in his autobiography about Rembrandt and his friend and colleague Jan Lievens, Huygens said, quote, "What I would especially like these two to do is to keep an inventory of their work, a description of their paintings. What this should contain for both the admiration and the instruction of future generations, after a discrete account of their way of working, is an indication with each painting of how and why it had been planned, composed, and executed." It would have saved a lot of trouble. But of course that inventory never happened, and nor was it at all probable that it would. But Huygens would have been all too aware of the preoccupations of collectors and connoisseurs in the 17th century, and here we have the famous satire on art criticism from the Lehman collection. When they considered paintings on offer in artists' studios, they were looking for quality and for the evidence of the hand of the master. The connoisseurs and collectors, one of whom is shown here with ass's ears on his head, they cared about authenticity and about whether a work was the painter's own or a pupil's. Values and prices were carefully discussed in these terms. Present-day discussions about authorship are nothing new, but we have the disadvantage of trying to untangle all the possibilities 4 centuries later. Let's look at a recent debate to see how arguments that we might categorize as connoisseurship in action actually function today. This is a painting now located in the Boijmans van Beuningen Museum in Rotterdam. It shows the familiar story of Tobit and Anna, a subject depicted by Rembrandt many times. Amidst great excitement, it was announced by the Boijmans in 2010 that the painting had been readmitted to the Rembrandt canon by the head of the Rembrandt Research Project, Ernst van der Wettering. He was now convinced of the authorship of the master himself. However, the party was spectacularly spoiled by the Boijmans Museum's own chief curator, Haroon Giltai, who went public with his opinion that the painting was certainly not by Rembrandt. A clearly embarrassed museum director made the best of a bad job by allowing these two eminent experts to fight it out on the walls of a special exhibition gallery. With the painting hung at the end of the room, one side wall was given to van der Wettering, the other to Giltye, and they laid out their arguments, each with a video presentation. These two short films can be seen on YouTube, and I urge you to look them up, and they make fascinating viewing. Van der Wettering's is entitled Rembrandt. Yes, it has to be by him. Complete with an exclamation mark. While Giltye's is called Rembrandt. No, I don't recognise him, with another exclamation mark. But why this is so instructive is that behind the headline titles, the two men set out classic arguments for and against a Rembrandt attribution of the kind that had been deployed over and over again by countless scholars. Here, in all its glorious confusion, is the essence of connoisseurship, the absolute subjectivity of the eye of the beholder. Anna and Tobit is painted over a still life by another hand. That shows in the X-ray. And immediately we have a technical disagreement between the two. Van der Wettering says it is not unknown for Rembrandt to have bought old panels for reuse, and that it supports the attribution. Giltye says it is something that Rembrandt would have avoided if possible. But the potent arguments between the two concern the connoisseur's more abstract judgments of quality and qualities. Giltye looks at brushwork and handling and says that the essential skill, fineness and precision that he expects of Rembrandt are simply not there. It is weak, badly painted, poorly conceived, and simply fails in comparison with, for example, the earlier paintings of the Concord of the State or the portrait of Titus, which hang nearby in Rotterdam. As an example, he points to Anna's profile and her hand and the spinning wheel, which you see towards the left. Nothing more than flat pancakes, he says, and there are many other weaknesses which simply cannot be ignored. Van der Wettering responds by saying that a comparison with the Concord of the State or the Titus is completely pointless, since Rembrandt's style was constantly evolving, and that by the time Tobit and Anna was painted in the late 1650s, he had developed a loose, economical manner of depicting figures and objects that was quite unlike what had gone before. Not only are those paintings for a completely different purpose, but also the same man is thinking differently. The late Rembrandt painted in an extraordinarily abbreviated way, apparently careless smudges of paint, almost accidentally capturing form and detail. As for the spinning wheel, it's part of Rembrandt's genius that he paints it spinning. It is shown as, quote, one big, beautiful, nicely painted blur. But what was constant to Rembrandt, says Van der Wettering, and what signifies his presence in this picture was his control of light and space, what in 17th century Dutch theory is referred to as houding. By the time of this painting, the drawing aspect is irrelevant, and it's about the way light moves over things. An X-ray shows that Rembrandt originally included another high window to the right of the present one, and at some stage he painted it out and then adjusted the shadows on the far wall and around the fireplace. This is the subtlety of Rembrandt and nobody else at work, says Van der Wettering. Forget the apparent crudeness of execution, the underlying vision of Rembrandt manipulating light and shade and form will always shine through if we are perceptive enough to recognize it. So here is a debate grounded in the basic language of pictorial connoisseurship, in which the two protagonists profess to be doing the same thing. Both claim to be looking for consistency in characteristic ways of working, but by defining quality and qualities in different ways, they arrive at opposite conclusions. Ernst van der Wettering, and I show you a picture of the head of the Rembrandt Research Project, who many of you will know, simply because it's worth saying that connoisseurs are real people with real opinions, and this is Ernst van der Wettering, who has more opinions about Rembrandt than most people. He will have the last word on this, because next year, 46 years after its foundation, the Rembrandt Research will publish the final volume of its corpus. Written by van der Wettering, it will contain summary entries of all the around 320 paintings that he believes are by the master's hand. And the Rotterdam Tobit and Anna will undoubtedly be included. This will be the definitive list for the foreseeable future. It will be interesting to see if another version of Tobit and Anna makes the list. This painting is in the National Gallery in London, and it has a checkered history of attribution. Painted around 1630, it was engraved as a Rembrandt by William van der Leeuw in the mid-1630s, which one might have thought pretty much settled the attribution, only 5 years or so after it was painted. However, in 1880, it was sold in London, attributed without explanation to Rembrandt's pupil, Gerrit Douw. And so it remained a Gerrit Douw until in 1926, Charles Holmes, the director of the National Gallery, this was still in a private collection at that time, published it in the Burlington magazine as a collaboration between Douw and Rembrandt. Some parts of it were so beautiful, he said, had such extraordinary quality, the two heads, for example, that they had to be by Rembrandt himself. The fact that he acquired it for the National Gallery shortly afterwards arouses one's suspicions that writing Rembrandt back on the frame was a diplomatic as well as an art historical judgment. Actually, as a parenthetical observation, the idea of Rembrandt and Douw collaborating is not at all unreasonable, because the striking 1631 double portrait of Prince Rupert and his tutor in the Getty Museum is now considered as a painting started by Rembrandt and finished by Douw. The X-ray, which you see on the right, unmistakably, and you'll have to take my word for it, shows Rembrandt's vigorous underpainting and a bolder composition. On the surface, however, most of the smooth, controlled finishing layers appear to be by Gerrit Douw. Back to the London Anna and Tobit. The joint attribution to Rembrandt and Douw lasted until it was awarded C category status, that is, not considered to be by Rembrandt, by the Rembrandt Research Project in 1982. It was, without doubt, they said, a Gerrit Douw. In the 1991-2 exhibition entitled Rembrandt, the Master and His Workshop, this hypothesis was tested by placing it between two undisputed Douw paintings of the same date. It was immediately apparent to everybody that the Anna and Tobit were so utterly different to the Dows on either side that the attribution to Douw could not be sustained. Events moved swiftly. An editorial in the Burlington magazine pointed out the failure of the comparison and said that perhaps the old idea that it was by Rembrandt might be correct after all. A review in Apollo by Walter Liedtke, who's here this evening, suggested the interesting idea that it might actually be by Jan Lievens, Rembrandt's other principal associate in Leiden. But the National Gallery, swept up in the general mood of exhilarating free-for-all, with the equivalent of an art historical grin and a shrug, changed the label back to Rembrandt. And that's how it is now exhibited. But I suspect it won't be on that definitive list when it appears next year. The point about the rotating attributions of this picture is that, Walter accepted, of course, there was very little real connoisseurship involved. Frankly, it was a matter of rounding up the usual Leiden suspects and mixing the brew with vague notions of quality and style and a dash of museum politics. But I don't mean to be too cynical. The golden age of Rembrandt connoisseurship produced such legendary figures as Willem von Bode, Abraham Bredius, Cornelis Hofstede de Groot, and William Valentina, who seemed at the time to have almost divine powers of perception when it came to identifying old master paintings. Although Bredius fans will want to forget his article in the Burlington magazine about the Van Meegeren Supper at Emmaus. With nothing but the power of their eyes and their impeccably trained visual memories, they established the fundamental Rembrandt canon for all subsequent Rembrandt scholars to work with. And the Rembrandt Research Project, since its inception in 1968, has made an extraordinary contribution to Rembrandt scholarship, despite early errors and sustained criticism from some quarters. It must be remembered that when it was formed, the situation seemed out of control, despite the determined efforts of 20th century scholars to bring order to the chaos in a steady process of refinement. Hofstede de Groot's catalogue of 1913 had 988 numbers. Bredius' catalogue of 1935 had 630, and Bauck's catalogue of 1966 rejected 70 of those. Gerson's catalogue of 1968 had only 420 numbers. The Rembrandt Research Project, RRP, started with the assumption that there were numerous fake Rembrandts in circulation, but they rapidly found that there were actually rather few, and that they were easily eliminated. The problem was the great number of perfectly genuine Dutch 17th century Rembrandtesque works from the wider circle of the master himself. This was not a problem of authenticity, but one of authorship. And that is still the case. Is the Rotterdam Anna and Tobit by Rembrandt, as Ernst van der Wettering believes, or by Barent Fabricius, as Haroon Giltai has proposed? Is the London Anna and Tobit by Rembrandt, Douw, or Lievens? The RRP began with the idea that science could provide definitive evidence about attribution, that different hands could be distinguished by analytical methods. However, they soon realized that painters in the same workshop, using the same materials, could not necessarily be distinguished by simple taxonomic data. Their disappointment in Volume 2 of the corpus is palpable. Quote, "One need hardly say that coming to terms with this experience, that these things could not be distinguished by scientific means, was a painful process. Insufficient knowledge of what might happen in 17th century workshops led to our expectations following too rigid a pattern." It's certainly true to say that a number of assumptions that we had about Rembrandt and his workshop had to be rethought. The long-standing idea, for example, that he did not make oil studies for his larger figure paintings put a significant question mark over the smaller, sketchier version of Margaretha de Geer, which hangs alongside the larger finished portrait in London, both seen here. Moreover, the small picture on the left was found to have a chalk ground on canvas, which hadn't been observed before. So for many years it was doubted, damned with faint praise as attributed to Rembrandt. Then other chalk grounds on canvas started to turn up as more pictures were analysed, and other examples of sketchy studies for larger figure paintings. For example, the head of a man in Copenhagen on the left, which seemed to serve the same function for the St. Bavo in Göteborg on the right. Old habits die hard, though, and the small Margaretha de Geer is still cautiously labelled, probably by Rembrandt, on the wall of the National Gallery in London. It's said that the current director, Nick Penny, doesn't like the words attributed to, and so probably is the new vocabulary in London. Similarly, it's now universally known that making copies was a common occurrence in the Rembrandt workshop, and that copying the master's self-portraits was one of the exercises given to pupils. When this was first understood, it caused great surprise, as the self-portraits had such a mystique, such an aura of being private, personal encounters, that it seemed somehow sacrilegious. But indeed they were copied, and this has led to great confusion as apparently identical self-portraits have surfaced in different collections. Fortunately, we have clear evidence of the process. One example that reinforces the idea that copying was routine in the Rembrandt workshop is the strange and remarkable self-portrait in Oriental costume, which is in the Petit Palais in Paris, which you see on the left. Rembrandt shows himself splendidly attired, striking a grand pose with a wonderfully shaggy dog in front of his feet. X-rays reveal, however, on the right screen, that the dog was not there originally. Rembrandt first painted himself with his feet fully visible. And that's not all, because he clearly had difficulty positioning the legs and feet. They're visible in two positions, and it seems they were first painted too long and then shortened. Eventually, Rembrandt, possibly in exasperation and possibly in a moment of inspiration, solved his problems by painting the poodle over them. That sequence of events is interesting enough, but there is a further twist. A studio copy of the picture exists before the dog was added, and moreover, careful comparison with the X-ray of the Paris picture shows that the legs in the copy are in the longer position, that is, before Rembrandt shortened them and before he added the dog. The copy shows Rembrandt's work at an intermediate stage, one that we know to have existed only from the X-ray, and that only somebody present in the studio, present in the workshop, copying Rembrandt's work could have seen. It's no exaggeration to say that in parallel with the Rembrandt research project, we have discovered a new sophistication in looking at the technical images of paintings. Here was a new form of connoisseurship. The interpretation of X-rays and infrared photographs gave a completely new set of visual criteria by which style and technique and authorship could be judged. The traditional connoisseur's scrupulous examination of surface brushwork and paint handling are augmented by X-ray images and may reveal an artist's characteristic preliminary underlayers or make clearer the structures of the paint on top. A particularly satisfying case of technical connoisseurship by the Rembrandt Research Project sorted out these two panels. The one on the left, now in Kassel, was long thought to be an authentic Rembrandt self-portrait. But then the one on the right, now in the Rijksmuseum, turned up at auction in 1959, which was the original. Straightforward examination of the paintings themselves certainly favours the Amsterdam picture on the right. The structure of the face is better understood. The light, daringly coming from behind the head, picks out the lit parts and reflects into the shadows with far greater accuracy. The shadowed eyes of the Kassel painting on the left are crude, dark blobs. And the hair, much of it scratched into the wet paint with a brush handle, a trademark of Rembrandt's much imitated by copyists, is coarse and repetitive in the Kassel picture, but varied and subtle in the Amsterdam painting. Confirmation of the status of the two versions lies in the X-rays, in which we see how the two portraits are mapped out. When painting portraits, in order for the head to stand out satisfactorily, Rembrandt would always lay in the background first and leave a reserve, a space, smaller than the head was going to be. He would then develop and extend the paint of the head out over the background. And this is perfectly evident in the Amsterdam X-ray on the right, where the shape left by the background is smaller than the finished head. But in the Kassel painting on the left, the reserve in the background is exactly the same size as the finished head, indicating that the painter here either knew in advance the precise shape and size of the head or painted it first and filled the background in around it. So the Kassel painting on the left is undoubtedly a copy of the Amsterdam painting on the right. For the final part of this lecture, I want to consider one of the most celebrated debates in recent annals of Rembrandt connoisseurship. In 1999, the National Gallery London was the co-organiser of the great Rembrandt self-portrait exhibition. And these two paintings, now on the screen, were hung side by side. On the left, a painting from the Moritz House, long admired as one of Rembrandt's key self-portraits, a stunningly refined and beautiful early work, a unique masterpiece of the late 1620s. On the right, a rather rough copy, now in Nuremberg, possibly of the 17th century, possibly even from the Rembrandt workshop. Or, that is how I would have described them in 1998, the year before the exhibition took place. The situation was then completely reversed. The rougher painting from Nuremberg on the right is now universally agreed to be Rembrandt's original self-portrait, and the smoother Moritz House painting on the left is the copy. The reason for this dramatic reversal of attribution was that, using infrared reflectography, Moritz House conservators discovered a careful drawing with the appearance of a tracing under their picture. Exactly the sort of drawing that a diligent copyist might make, and exactly the sort of drawing that Rembrandt never made under his paintings. Until that moment, scholars had been completely seduced by the refined and meticulous quality of the Moritz House painting. Never mind that it was actually too refined for Rembrandt's style in 1629. It was so beautiful, had such extraordinary quality that it had to be by him. Never mind either that the rough painting in Nuremberg was actually more typical of Rembrandt in 1629. It was dirty, neglected, unimpressive, and therefore disregarded. This extraordinary exchange of attributions was a celebrated example of technical connoisseurship in action. Technical evidence led directly to a logical art historical conclusion. End of story. Or maybe not. In philosophical terms, we were applying the principle of induction, and much of connoisseurship is based on induction, testing our observations against past experience. The presence of a traced underdrawing and what was now perceived as an over-smooth technique rejected the Moritz House painting. But as philosophers will tell you, there is the famous problem of induction. Just because something is normally true, just because 50 or 100 Rembrandts don't have a traced underdrawing, for example, it doesn't mean to say that it might not be different for the 51st or the 101st. And indeed, there is an alternative hypothesis that was put forward by scholars reluctant to jettison the Moritz House picture from the Rembrandt oeuvre. And the theory goes like this. The Nuremberg picture probably is the prime version. But what if Rembrandt had deliberately set out to produce his self-portrait in two contrasting styles, one rough and one smooth? The relative aesthetics of rough and smooth paint were much debated in 17th century art theory and much debated in recent Rembrandt scholarship. So what if Rembrandt himself had traced his own first version and then reproduced it in a different, smoother style to demonstrate his technical virtuosity? Is it likely? Did Rembrandt copy himself? Probably not. And the more plausible explanation is that the Moritz House painting is simply a beautiful copy by somebody else. But the element of doubt that the hypothesis introduces means that we can never be certain. There's been a determined effort in recent years to reinstate a number of early Rembrandts based on the possibility that he did indeed deliberately produce works of varying styles. This crystallized in the remarkable exhibition called The Mystery of the Young Rembrandt in 2001-2, in which a number of intriguing reattributions were made. The Rembrandt Research Project, with its final publication next year, is finishing on an expansive note after its initial reductive one. Importantly, what it has done in part is to look back to 17th century aesthetics and art theory in order to refine its 21st century attributions. Thank you.
From the Rembrandt paradigm, we turn to our second speaker, whose title is Small Differences, Ekphrasis, and Connoisseurship.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a great honor to be here, a great honor to speak after David. My talk will begin with Philip Pouncy, the British connoisseur, a recognized authority in the field of Italian drawings. A volume published in Italy collects his usually dense and short contributions in 3 languages, 4 catalogues based on exhibits which took place, respectively, at the Fitzwilliam Museum, the Uffizi, the British Museum, the Louvre, celebrated Pouncy's triumphs as a connoisseur. The introductions to those catalogues invariably mentioned an attribution which achieved a quasi-exemplary status, becoming an epitome of Pouncy's uncanny gifts, as well as a model for the connoisseur's practice. Here is a telling comment by John Gear, who co-authored with Pouncy the 2-volume catalogue of the drawings by Raphael and his circle preserved at the British Museum. Quote, "It may be asked, how does an artistic personality reveal itself? In addition to the Morellian criteria presented by such secondary physical features as the form of hands or ears, there are individual patterns of composition and grouping into which the draftsman falls unconsciously and which are as unmistakable as a writer's choice of words and the cadence of sentences. And above all, there is the psychology of the artist as expressed in nuances of facial expression." A classic example of the last type of attribution, Gear went on, is that of the study of a crouching nude man by Bastianino, which had laid unnoticed for more than 200 years among the anonymous sheets at Christ Church. No drawings from the hand of this obscure Ferrarese imitator of Michelangelo were known when Mr. Pouncy remarked that, quote, within the quote, "If Bastianino had made drawings, this is exactly the kind of drawing that one would have expected from him," unquote. The suggestion was triumphantly confirmed by the discovery in a painting by Bastianino of the figure for which the drawing undoubtedly served as a study, unquote. This story has been repeated several times by John Gear himself, by Nicholas Turner, by Evelyn Baku, more or less in the same words. But as soon as we read Pouncy's article devoted to Bastianino's drawings, we are confronted with a somewhat different version. Quote, "We became aware of Bastianino's stylistic originality," Pouncy remarked, "to a large extent thanks to the way in which Roberto Longhi, in his Officina Ferrarese in 1934, brilliantly presented his concept concerning Bastianino's quality, a concept later developed by Francesco Arcangeli. This allowed us to share his poetic vision inhabited by titani cinerei e nebbiosi, ash-gray and foggy titans," unquote. The same words, titani cinerei e nebbiosi, which Longhi had used to evoke Bastianino's paintings, surface again in the description of Pouncy's encounter with the Christ Church drawing. Quote, "In this case, my attention was attracted by the bizarre physical appearance, as well as by the subtlety in which the body has been shaped, conveying not only its massive character, but also, to a certain extent, the atmosphere which it inhabits. He is not only a titan, but a foggy titan," unquote. The next step, that is the identification of the painting based on the drawing, a detail from an altarpiece by Bastianino, the same altarpiece in color, representing the Last Judgment, originally at Rovello Porro, now in Ferrara's Certosa. This identification was not made by Pouncy himself, but by Meryl, his wife. The disappearance of her name from the later accounts of Pouncy's attribution may be ascribed to a gender bias, shared apparently by some distinguished art historians, both male and female. More puzzling is the disappearance, in the aforementioned remarks, of Pouncy's crucial reference to Longhi's Titani, Cinerei, e Nebbiosi, ash grey and foggy titans. Compared with the detailed, vivid account I just read, Gier's comment looks disappointingly vague. Quote, "Such feats of divination like Pouncy's seem miraculous, but they are achieved only by a prolonged and single-minded absorption in the subject." Unquote. What we came across is indeed something more specific, a mental process in which, incidentally, the artist's psychology, which Gier mentioned as a crucial element of the attribution practice, regarded as a kind of empathy, played no role whatsoever. Pouncy's act of recognition had different roots, which reveal, I will argue, some of the theoretical implications of connoisseurship. Let's look at the case more closely. Sebastiano Filippi, nicknamed Bastianino, was born in Ferrara around 1532 and died in 1602. His father, Camillo, was also a painter. Bastianino shows up at the very end of Roberto Longhi's Officina Ferrarese, a book conceived as a detailed comment to a great exhibit held in Ferrara in 1933. It has been republished several times with substantial additions. In one paragraph, amounting to 16 lines in the first edition, Longhi identified Bastianino, virtually unknown outside Ferrara, as, quote, "the greatest poet of Italian mannerism after El Greco," and concluded, "his ash grey and foggy titans, Titani, Cinerei, and Nebbiosi, will hopefully make him, in the near future, the favorite artist of some young critic," unquote. Pouncy must have read those lines in his mid-20s. He was born in 1910, being 20 years younger than Longhi. Although his note on Bastianino's drawings was published much later, Pouncy had engaged himself in a dialogue with Longhi's Officina Ferrarese a long time before. In fact, since his very first essay, Ercole Grandi's Masterpiece, which came out in the Burlington magazine in 1937. With the help of X-rays, a technology rarely used by art historians at that time, Pouncy developed Longhi's argument on the dual authorship of the Palastrozzi at the National Gallery in London, suggesting that the unnamed artist involved in the altarpiece, along with the more famous Lorenzo Costa, was Gianfrancesco Maineri. In his Ampliamenti nell'Officina Ferrarese, issued in 1940, Longhi answered at length, rejecting Pouncy's identification, which is still widely regarded as the most likely, but the debate is still open. 35 years later, Longhi's forewords, used to depict the work of Bastianino, ash grey and foggy titans, paved the way to Pouncy's attribution of the Christ Church drawing. How was this sequence possible? To answer this question, one has to address a crucial element of Longhi's work, his dense, vivid literary style, which contributed, along with his extraordinary gifts as a connoisseur, to his almost legendary fame among 20th century art historians. But in the English-speaking world, the name of Longhi has remained, beyond the specialist circle, virtually unknown, notwithstanding two recent translations. In a recent, and in many ways symptomatic book, entitled "The Books That Shaped Art History from Gombrich and Greenberg to Alpers and Krauss, Longy's name is never mentioned. Too much of a connoisseur, perhaps, for the editors of a book whose introduction dismissively refers to the minutiae of connoisseurship, in allusion to Berenson's drawings of the Florentine painters to which an essay is devoted. Moreover, and more importantly, Longy's highly idiosyncratic language created an obstacle which prevented a more widespread impact of his work, a price to be paid by his use of literary style as a cognitive tool. This last point, which is crucial from a theoretical point of view, was made by the great Romance philologist Gianfranco Contini in a series of essays devoted to Roberto Longhi, considered as the most prominent master of Italian 20th century prose. I will try to unfold the implications of Contini's dense, often cryptic remarks, following a path opened up by André Chastel in an essay devoted to Longhi as a genius of ekphrasis. A large amount of research has been devoted to ekphrasis, a rhetorical genre based on the description of works of art, either real or imagined. In ancient Greece, where the genre emerged, ekphrasis focused on schema, a broad notion which included what we usually label iconography. Longhi's reinterpreted the genre, as Chastel pointed out, creating, quote, verbal equivalences of works of art. A quote from Longhi, as we will see. Descriptions which, we might say, relying upon the ancient Greek terminology, aim to convey not only their schema, but their ergasia, their stylistic features as well. For Longhi, attribution often came at the end of ekphrasis as a conclusion of it. The expression verbal equivalences, equivalenze verbali, had been used by Longhi himself to define his own method in an early polemical review published in 1920. The passage is well known, but it deserves a further analysis. But first of all, some information about its intellectual context. In its Aesthetics, 1902, a book which had a deep impact on philosophical debates in Italy and elsewhere, Benedetto Croce had insisted on the deep unity of art. Its media, verbal, pictorial, musical, and so on, were irrelevant, insofar as the critic's aim was to identify the lyrical core of specific artworks. In 1912, Longhi objected that the new aesthetics, that is Croce's, diluted the concreteness of pictorial style into vague psychological categories. Some years later, in 1919, in an essay entitled The History and Criticism of Visual Arts and Its Present Conditions, Croce mentioned Longhi as a temperamentful, as the Germans say, writer, influential, competent, and highly intelligent, but rejected his argument without naming him, along with, quote, the bizarre idea of an art criticism competing with art and expressing it through a new medium, unquote. Longhi answered in 1920 in a review of Enzo Petraccone's posthumous book on Luca Giordano, the Neapolitan 17th century painter. Petraccone had addressed some criticism to Longhi's essay on Mattia Preti, but the real target of Longhi's oblique rejoinder was Croce, who had introduced Petraccone's book. Here is Longhi, quote, "We believe that it's possible to create specific verbal equivalences of specific visual experiences, equivalences which may have a quasi-genetic dimension, insofar as they replicate the way in which a work of art has been created and expressed. We don't know whether this is a translation, and since it has been demonstrated that translations are impossible, we hope that this would not be the case. But since a personal involvement is inevitably associated to historical knowledge, we believe that our approach may have a role in a methodically sound historical criticism of visual arts. Unquote. In a brilliant essay, Cesare Garboli emphasized the ironical overtone of Longhi's remark on the impossibility of translation, unfolding some of its implications. But to fully appreciate the irony, we must identify its target. Benedetto Croce's rejection of the very possibility of translation put forward in his Aesthetic, a book whose full title read Estetica come scienza dell'espressione e linguistica generale, aesthetic as a science of expression and general linguistics. For Croce, the identity of aesthetic and linguistics implied that both deal with unique phenomena, since, as the linguists say, there are no identical words, no synonyms, no homonyms. Translations are, Croce argued, rigorously impossible. Those who, like myself, believe in the possibility of translation would describe this radically idealistic position in Saussurean terms as follows. For Croce, and especially for the early Croce, language coincides with parole. Langue should not be taken into account, being a mere fiction, not a reality. Longhi, as we have seen, insisted that these verbal equivalences of visual works of art were indeed translations, a remark which had positive, not only polemical implications. Here I am once again following in the footsteps of Cesare Garboli. In another fundamental essay on Longhi's early intellectual development, Garboli wrote, quote, "In the morphology of Italian idealism, the very peculiar variation introduced by Longhi, that is, a contamination of materialism and idealism," unquote, is remote from Croce's philosophy. In fact, this Garboli can be regarded as a version of Giovanni Gentile's philosophy, Idealismo Attuale. I don't know, Garboli commented, if and to what extent and up to which date Longhi read Gentile, but this is not so important, unquote. Something more will be said on this issue in a moment, but first a general remark. For more than 50 years, the Italian philosophical scene was dominated by Croce and Gentile, first as friends, later as enemies. Their theoretical divergences became also political and more bitter, with the emergence of fascism, a movement, then a regime, strongly supported by Gentile, who became its official philosophical representative, and opposed, after an initially benevolent attitude, by Croce. The divergence between Croce and Gentile, which had emerged in 1913, was in 1920 still restricted to the theoretical domain. One of the issues on which they debated was translation. In my view, Longhi must have read Gentile's essay Il diritto e il torto delle traduzioni, The Right and Wrong of Translations, first published in the opening issue of Rivista di Cultura, printed on April 15, 1920. Gentile initially agreed with Croce's argument on the impossibility of translations, but then, with a typical dialectical move, turned it upside down. We always translate, insofar as every act of reading or of thinking somebody else's thought is a translation. Originals do not exist, a conclusion which Gentile developed in other texts, arguing that the past, as an objective entity distinct from the act of thinking, does not exist. The echoes of this debate are still with us. In an essay entitled Reading is Like Translating, Hans-Georg Gadamer mentioned the old Italian motto traduttore, traditore, translator, traitor, which he curiously enough ascribed to Croce, and then argued following Gentile, although without mentioning him, that reading a text, including texts written in our mother tongue, implies a translation. A comment on contemporary hermeneutics and translation would take me into a different direction. Let me go back to Longhi, more specifically to the contamination of materialism and idealism garbally detected in Longhi's thought. I will try to clarify this issue relying upon some, so far strangely unexploited, evidence. Longhi's library, which is preserved along with his splendid collection of paintings in Florence at the Fondazione bearing his name. Longhi used to underline passages and to scribble comments, occasionally in shorthand, on the margins of the books he owned. A copy of the third edition of Croce's Aesthetics, published in 1908, allows us to follow at a close distance the response of the young reader. Longhi, born in 1890, must have read it first in his 20s, then again several times, for certain in 1941. Some of the passages most heavily underlined deal with Croce's aforementioned argument, rejecting the distinction among arts, poetry, painting, music, and so forth, as theoretically irrelevant. In a typical passage, Croce remarked that Aristotle was right in saying that the difference between poetry and prose cannot be identified in an external feature, like verse. Poetry and prose, yes, but poetry and painting, no, Longhi noted. These laconic words pointed at a profound theoretical divergence. For Croce, art was an all-encompassing category of the spirit, defined as identity between lyrical intuition and expression. But expression should not be confused with the intuition's physical embodiment or extrinsication, estrinsecazione. Longhi's impatience with this argument suddenly erupts in his marginal notes. When Croce, implicitly echoing once again Aristotle, wrote, quote, "Aesthetic judgment on a work of art is totally unrelated to a judgment on the artist's morality," unquote, Longhi sarcastically commented, quote, "Therefore, when the painter materially paints and extrinsicates, estrinseca, is merely a practical man," unquote, materialmente dipinge, materially paints. What Croce regarded as a mere empirical phenomenon, the materiality of the object, was at the center of Longhi's approach, both as a connoisseur and an art historian. In fact, without this commitment to the object, that object, located in a definite space and time, having specific physical features, connoisseurship would be unthinkable. But Longhi's peculiar mixture of idealism and materialism must be looked at in a much larger historical framework. Many years ago, in an essay which dealt, among many other things, with Giovanni Morelli and connoisseurship, I pointed out that we usually take for granted a dichotomy between texts and certain images, which is, on the contrary, the outcome of a silent, long-term cultural trajectory. On the one hand, we assume that a text or a number will remain the same in whatever medium, in whatever handwriting, in whatever font is reproduced. On the other, we assume that a reproduction of a painting by Raphael or Rembrandt cannot, by definition, replicate the original. On the one hand, we have invisible texts, on the other, visible and material objects. I advanced this argument long time before coming across a handwritten remark in which Longhi noted that Croce's argument about art was based, and based only, on poetry. In his youth, Longhi was briefly tempted by a version of extreme formalism which ostensibly ignored names and chronology. After a few years, as I argued elsewhere, he chose a very different approach, focusing on names and chronology. But his passionate commitment to the materiality of the object as well as to the possibility of using verbal equivalences as an indispensable interpretive tool, never failed. In listening at my comments about ekphrasis, most of this audience may have recalled Michael Baxendale's reflections on the same issue. In this case, convergence does not imply independence. Baxendale was well aware of Longy's work, which he repeatedly praised in strong terms, especially notable in a writer known for his laconic restraint. In his essay on Jacopo Sadoleto's Laocoon, Baxendale wrote, quote, "All criticism lives with co-presences, whether something like the Bible or Ovid's Metamorphoses, or just other criticism, as, for example, anyone intending to discourse on Piero della Francesca will have to do with the co-presence of Roberto Longhi," unquote. Here, texts, the Bible, Ovid's Metamorphoses, are compared to pictures, Piero's frescoes. But in the same essay, as elsewhere, Baxendale pointed out that A, ekphrasis, a verbal description, should we say verbal equivalent, is a necessary tool of art criticism. B, that, quote, language is not very well equipped to offer a notation of a particular picture, unquote. Baxendale mentioned two reasons for this inadequacy. A, language is a generalizing tool. B, it is temporally linear. True, if a picture is simultaneously available in its entirety, looking at a picture is as temporally linear as language, unquote, but at a completely different, indeed incompatible pace. I would add a third reason. Language is discrete. A picture is a continuum. What one offers in the description, Baxendale concluded, commenting upon ekphrases provided by writers as distant as Libanius and Kenneth Clark, quote, is a representation of thinking about a picture more than a representation of a picture, unquote. Might we also add a translation? As you see, I am trying to create a bridge between Baxendale and Longhi. Baxendale as a reader and to a certain extent a translator of Longhi. Retrospectively, I'm tempted to read Longhi's ekphrases as an experiment aiming to overcome the inadequacies of language emphasized by Baxendale. Let me recall a famous example. Longhi's, I realized that I didn't move enough. So, okay, sorry. I was not looking at the screen. So this is obviously the painting Pouncy worked on at the National Gallery. But this is a very bad reproduction of Piero's fresco. Let me recall a famous example. Longhi's description of one of Piero's frescoes in Arezzo, the battle between Constantinus and Maxentius. This description was first published in his 1914 essay Piero dei Franceschi e le origini della pittura veneziana. Longhi was 24. Longhi was so fond of this page that he quoted it again twice. First, in a series of notes published only posthumously, delivered in the same year, 1914, in Rome, to a class of secondary school students. Later, one of them became his wife, Lucia Lopresti, better known as Anna Banti, her pen name. And secondly, in his book on Piero della Francesca, 1927, in the latter instance, the self-quotation, put in quotation marks, was followed by a short, half-ironical, half-disanciating comment, which I will read as well. Here is Longhi, quote, "Slow, sure irrigation of the meadows of the painting, a huge expanse of horses and men in the nearly flat low relief of color, reiterated foreshortenings, flattened breasts, fragmented knees, rounded hooves, perfectly semicircular rear profiles, round wells of form stagnate, blotchy barren hills compose a patchwork, shafts and lances leave their marks in liquid ivory, amber, ebony, upon one side of a blue field of sky roofed with light-edged clouds, while on the other is hung out to dry softly with no linear borders the victory banner of the defeated general, a banner without which I think the Pesaro family would have had no banner, at least in art, lances without which the lancers at Breda would still remain, I believe, unarmed in painting. And oh, you incorruptible spheres of pale felt, stay poised upon the pewter of those helmets until, light dazzled, you become, upon the blue breasts of heaven, medals awarded for coloristic valor. In such words, this Longhi, 1927, in such words did I once attempt to express, even if in an overly romantic style, the effect made by this great painting, unquote. An exercise in purely formal description, yes and no. The subtext and allusions of Longhi's dense page reveal the perspective from which he approached Piero della Francesca's fresco, taking the word perspective in a metaphorical but also literal sense, since the description obviously echoes Cézanne's famous remark in his letter to Émile Bernard, dated April 15, 1904, quote, to treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, the cone, everything in proper perspective, so that each side of an object or a plane is directed towards a central point, unquote. The allusions to Titian's altarpiece for the Pesaro family and Velázquez, a detail with the lances, Velázquez, the surrender of Breda, point at a historical trajectory which from Piero della Francesca to Giovanni Bellini, only indirectly evoked, ends with Cézanne. Equally important is the very opening of the description, marked by a series of nominal phrases, a linguistic device whose main feature, as Émile Benveniste argued in a famous essay, is the absence of temporal connotations inevitably associated to verbs. Nominal phrases could work as a compromise between the linearity of verbal language and the non-linearity of pictures. The sentence I started from, titanici, nerei e nebbiosi, ash gray and foggy titans, can also be reworked as a nominal phrase. Moreover, it is, like Longhi's Ekphrasis or Piero della Francesca's battle, densely metaphorical. Ash gray, foggy. It is helpful to remind the Greek etymology of the word metaphor, metaphorein, which is literally replicated in Latin by the word translatio, hence translation. In order to translate a pictorial style into words, into verbal equivalents, one has to rely upon metaphors, mostly synesthetic. But can metaphors have a referential dimension? This looks like a paradoxical question in the light of the well-known attack launched, especially in 17th century France, against metaphor, which classicist taste rejected as an irrational trope. It has been pointed out, however, that metaphors can also be the starting point of a mental experiment, as if. Pouncy's brilliant attribution of the Christ Church drawing to Bastianino shows the experimental, predictive quality of Longhi's ekphrastic metaphor. This is in many ways an extreme case, but it throws some light on a widespread and still insufficiently explored phenomenon, that is the manifold role played by words in connoisseurship, as well as, on a more general level, in visual appreciation. As Michael Baxendale remarked in his book on Quattrocento Italian painting, quote, the only practical way of publicly making discriminations is verbally, unquote. Words mediate between painting and experience, visual experiences, social experiences of all kinds. we speak about paintings. They resist to words. We insist. We speak again. Parler peinture, as the French say, is a never-ending activity.
So the format now will invite our two speakers to the table to begin a conversation amongst themselves, which can include you and your questions afterwards. So I asked our speakers to prepare first a couple of minutes of comment on what they heard from the other speaker. So we'll start.
He's just been talking, so I'll give you a rest. Thank you, Carlo. I enjoyed that enormously. And just as a very small aside, I'm very delighted that you gave credit to Mireille Pouncy as well as Philip Pouncy. Mireille was one of the great unsung heroes of art history in London, and long after Philip's death she would hold court in their wonderful house in West London and show the Pouncy collection. So it brought back a lot of memories when you mentioned her. But back to connoisseurship and the power of words. We have rather skated over the history of connoisseurship, and Morelli has had a mention here and there, but the idea that connoisseurship is a non-verbal skill, a non-verbal art, of course, is something we have to grasp. If a parent sees his or her child in a class of schoolmates, they immediately recognise their child out of the other 30 or 40 children. Why is that? It's to do with recognition, it's to do with visual memory, it's to do with all sorts of unconscious processes going on in the brain. And it's thought, or used to be thought, that connoisseurship was the same process, that an art historian, a connoisseur, could recognise certain hands at work in art or in painting. This, of course, became somewhat discredited in the great 19th century confusion between connoisseurship and the art market, where connoisseurs, of course, were ill-used and probably had themselves to blame for the general derision in which connoisseurs were held when people like Berenson were making huge profits from the results of their connoisseurship. But the main problem was that actually some of these people, some of these 19th century connoisseurs did have astounding visual memories. They were amazingly skilled at recognising the hands of old master painters. So there was something there, some unspoken, some unverbalised, some impossible to verbalise skill. But they had to explain their reasoning to everybody else. And this is where language failed. And this is where the whole point about ekphrasis and translation becomes relevant. That it is impossible to translate visual memory into a reasoned argument, or at least it's extremely difficult, and very few people have the skill to do it. Actually, Ernst van der Wettering, who I showed you a photograph of earlier, is one of the few people that can do it and does it amazingly well. This is a very remarkable gift. But essentially what we're talking about in the history of connoisseurship is an attempt to bypass the failure of language. Morelli tried to make it scientific. He tried to say, well, there are certain features of a painting, certain analytical features that you can identify. And these, of course, we all know are the unconscious parts of a painting, the ears, the fingernails, the curls of hair, that you can identify as being by the hand of a particular artist. But of course then you have to explain, it's still subjective, it's not actually objective, you have to explain why this curl of hair looks like that curl of hair, or this fingernail looks like that fingernail. And so everywhere language and verbalizing have to be introduced in order to explain the instincts of a connoisseur, and that's where it falls down. And I often say, when I'm talking about Rembrandt or other painters, that you can look at the same passage of paint and you can say there is a piece of really careless, sloppy, poor painting, or you can say there is a piece of brilliant improvisation. The same thing. And language steers you in the right direction, but that's where it's failed and where it's been discredited. Perhaps I should just let you come in now, Carlo.
Well, I will try to comment not only on your enormously challenging presentation, but also on your comments, what we just heard. It seems to me that what emerged from your presentation was something we are all aware of, but it was the argument was particularly forceful, meaning that connoisseurship is a social activity. In that sense, I would say, well, the connection between let's say, connoisseurship and the art market can be unpleasant and can lead to unpleasant results. Certainly, Berenson used to work with sometimes with a forger like Ioni, but the connection exists. Since the 17th century Rome, Mancini working with collectors like Giustiniani and so on. So the connection is there. And I think the, let's say, mistakes due to inadvertency, ignorance, or even corruption cannot be used against connoisseurship. Like, let's say, a bad doctor is not an argument against medicine as such. Probably the analogy is not so absurd, because actually I tried to argue that there is a deep connection, and actually Mancini was, I mean, it was a chiatra pontificio, he was a doctor of the Pope. So let's say diagnostic eye can be used not only for patients but also for paintings. Now, social activity. I was thinking about philology, inevitably, because I'm not an art historian, although I am deeply interested in art history, and in paintings. So I was thinking about philology because I think that basically what I took from some of the comments you quoted was the role played by, I would say, Lectio difficilior in looking at the painting. In other words, when there are details which are banal and details which are not banal, we have to assume that, let's say, the original painting is on the non-banal side. And I think this worked. I was trying to react to, let's say, some of those paintings I was familiar with, other ones I was not familiar with. But, I mean, I think that this is something which can be put on the side of evidence. That's the crucial word for me. In other words, connoisseurship can be connected to evidence. Which kind of evidence? Now, I remember that I once wrote an article on Longhi in which I put in the title the two words mostrare e dimostrare. It works better in Italian, meaning to point at and to demonstrate. But in that sense, to point at, it's the act of pointing, saying, look at this, look at that. And in that pointing, words have no role. But then I was confronted with the Pouncy-Longhi relationship, and so I started to think about the role of words. Now, it's interesting that you started with some quotations, and those quotations were ludicrous, in a sense, some of them, because, the ekphrastic quality was zero.
Yeah.
And there was no evidence at all, although they were pointing at the paintings. And then you raised a very interesting argument, meaning the relationship between the eye and the technological eye. I would be interested in knowing more about that, because in a way, I wonder whether, let's say, the technological eye does not provide us with evidence which must also be interpreted and therefore may be submitted to a kind of ekphrastic procedure. Yeah. So, it's an endless activity, as I say.
Just to take that point up, those 2 points up, very often the analysis of a painting by present-day connoisseurs is banal. And this is an unfortunate thing, that when you look at paintings, you pick out trivial and banal aspects and draw attention to them. And this is the level on which quite a lot of present-day connoisseurship is conducted. The other point about technological images being having a sort of ekphrastic significance is indeed true. When you think of ekphrasis as being the translation of, say, a visual image into language, you also have an ekphrasis of a visual object being translated in some other visual sense, in an X-ray, in an infrared photograph, in some partial technological account of the object. It's also being translated, and the technician, the scientist, the conservator who's making that translation is choosing the terms of that translation, and therefore is influencing the argument in ways that he or she controls. So there is a sort of multiple ekphrasis going on here, both in terms of trying to describe in language, but also translating into technological imagery.
If I could just follow in here on much the same set of points, but shifting the social context slightly to an educational one, because it seems to me that in parallel, both of you have argued in different ways for, in some sense, the place of connoisseurship, however we want to describe it, amongst the human sciences. I was struck, first of all, in the discussion of the Rotterdam painting. The presentations are all really determined by the starting point. The question then determines the answer. Which question takes precedence over the other question, which context over another, is indeterminate. And similarly, the problem of language seems to take us directly really into an instructional context. How do we train the use of language?
I would say, I'm thinking. I would say, first of all, different layers, historical layers of language. So, for instance, in the case of Longhi, let's take Longhi as an example. He was deeply conversant with, let's say, writing, what is called letteratura artistica, Kunstliteratur. So he was actually using words which have been used by Mancini or by painters, because there is also the lingua delle botteghe, the workshop language, which is sometimes different, and this is fascinating. I think that it's really sometimes usually difficult to grasp, but sometimes it percolates in learned literature, and I think it's crucial, because it goes back to a way of perceiving the work and how people were talking about, for instance, in Rembrandt's workshop, Rembrandt talking how to his pupils, and not only pointing but also using words. Which words?
Yeah. And we know more and more about the Rembrandt workshop as a commercial operation. This has been known for some time, that it was a tremendous shock, I suppose, to many 20, 30 years ago, to discover that Rembrandt's self-portraits, far from being this sort of rather mystical communication with his own image, were in fact commercial products. They were there to be sold. They were there to be overpainted by pupils to turn into a trony of a Polish nobleman. Essentially, this was a great surprise, that the Rembrandt self-portrait was not the sort of sacred text that generations of Romantic scholars would have it. But I just want to open up the discussion into something a little bit wider, talking about social context, as you were, and that is that connoisseurship was originally not about the actual properties of a work of art, but a general sense of quality, the general sense that a work of art was superb, of the highest quality, that it fulfilled certain criteria of the most elevated kind. And this is what the 17th century connoisseurs were looking for. It happened to coincide with the fact that objects of the highest quality tended to be works by the greatest masters. But subsequent to that, people have tried to impose their own sense of quality onto works of art. So the Mauritshuis self-portrait, this exquisitely fine and beautiful painting of Rembrandt's, apparently a self-portrait by Rembrandt, was so exquisitely fine that people accepted that as the Rembrandt, even though it was atypical of what you might expect of a Rembrandt at that time. And then let's just fast forward to 1871, when an extraordinary event happened in Dresden, and that is when the two versions of Hans Holbein's Bürgermeister, Madonna of the Bürgermeister Meyer, were placed side by side. There was the version that had been in Dresden for a very long time. It was universally accepted as Holbein's masterpiece. It was exquisite, it was flawless, it had the most beautiful brush-stroke-free surface. And then in 1822, another version had surfaced at an auction in Paris, which was then held in a collection in Darmstadt. For the first time in 1871, the two versions were brought together in Dresden, and the Darmstadt version, the rougher, more edgy version, was declared the original Holbein. The smooth, perfect Dresden version, which is what appealed to the German sensibility in the 19th century, was rejected as not as a copy. But because of its fineness, because of its perfection, because of its exquisite surface, everybody wanted it to be the prime version. But in fact, scholars in 1871 gathered and declared the Darmstadt version to be the original version, because actually, when you looked at the technique, it was closer to what you really expected of a Holbein. So the perfect version had to be dismissed. So there's a certain sense of expectation which changes from generation to generation.
this seems like a good moment to throw open the floor to questions. Alessandra?
I have a question for Professor Ginsburg. It seems to me that there are two kinds of translations that you have addressed in your talk. One is the translation from images into words through this conversation between Gentile, Croce, and Longhi. And I think we are all convinced that par les peintures of the need to insist not to translate images into words is possible. But then you mentioned another kind of translation, which is the translation of the highly idiosyncratic language of Longhi, the difficulty of translating his language. And this is why you mentioned that he's not part of these anthologies, etc. But then you presented these beautiful translations of his work. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about your experience of translating this idiosyncratic language.
It's not my translation.
Okay.
There are two translations.
Yeah.
Actually, the first one, which I own a copy of it, which I came across in Santa Monica years ago. It was published in 1930, and the name of the translator is Leonard Penlock, a pseudonym. Actually, Longhi referred very quickly to, let's say, the difficulty of that translation. This is Piero della Francesca's book, from which I quoted that passage. Now, the book has been retranslated again recently, and I quoted from the more recent translation. It would be interesting to compare them. Certainly in the first one, in the earlier one, there are mistakes. Now, that page is particularly idiosyncratic. Actually, Longhi ironically referred to his early style, saying it was a bit too much collet-monté, too stiff. Later on, it became more colloquial, but only to a degree. And there is this metaphorical density, which is very peculiar. Now, is this a flourish? I mean, for many readers of Longhi, coming from a different tradition, this looks like D'Annunzio. I think that D'Annunzio is really a peripheral influence, and Contini emphasized this very well. So basically, we are back to what I regarded as the most difficult and more challenging theoretical point, meaning the cognitive quality of style and the referential quality of that style, which made it predictive, which is astonishing. So Pouncy recognizing something through Longhi's description, being acted upon by Longhi's words. Now, I'm not saying that this is the rule, of course, but I think I'm fond of anomalies, Anyway.
Could we, thank you very much, could we not say though that the type of predictive use of verbal translation actually is much older than Longhi?
Oh, sure.
See that in fact the whole Renaissance or 18th century project of trying to recuperate classical antiquity through descriptions is in fact exactly that, of trying to match images with words. Of course we now do it very differently, but that it was an attempt to access a recognition that those descriptions in some way did contain a predictive truth.
Let's try to focus on that word predictive, which I use as a kind of paradox, because in a way, even if we have that example, meaning Pouncy recognizing Bastianino's drawing, it's quite difficult to find examples like this, because we have, let's say, retrospective descriptions of, let's say, fragments of antiquity. But so it would be interesting to see whether those descriptions played a role in later connoisseurship. Maybe, the case is not so extreme, like, let's say, attributing a drawing to a painter by whom there are no drawings. But I think that the predictive quality, I'm, let's say, reacting to your suggestion, the predictive quality in antiquarian writing, for instance, could be tested in principle. People being able to recognize something, well, I mean, okay, sorry. I was thinking about, let's say, factual descriptions like Pausanias. That's obvious. But I'm not talking about the schema. I'm talking about ergasia. That's the example we are talking about, which is much more extreme. So let's say, because certainly, I mean, the use of Pausanias or Vasari, by the way, in order to recognize a lost painting or, that's obvious. But the style, that's different.
David, I was surprised by one thing you said about Ernst and writing, which is relevant to this discussion. Although I did know what you mean, how articulate he can be in describing a work of art. Ernst, back in the early 80s, we all knew him pretty well. He was the guy, unlike Joshua Brown, who would throw out ideas and see if they stick to the wall, like an attribution. It was that led me to think rather preposterously that maybe Jan Lievens was a good idea for that picture in the National Gallery.
Not preposterous.
Well, I mean, it was in the mix.
Yes.
It had quality, so
Yes.
you could, but it doesn't stick in the long run. And it seems that Ernst, over the years, who emerged as the head of the project, in fact, the project solely with assistants who very much defer to Ernst. And incidentally, one of them, Folker Mann, you mentioned next year is the last word on such and such a picture. Well, Folker's doing his own
a rival version, I know.
So, and I think as we've established, criticism, you said it in other words, is an ongoing process. It never ends. So, we'd better be careful about the idea of any last words. But what I would say about Ernst now, who's a friend of mine, and I enormously respect his scholarship and his knowledge, is that I think he first has subjective impulses, and then he defends them in writing, which is analytical, a barrage of description, analysis, technical evidence, and for the historian, hypotheses that make certain pictures believable. Like there's oil sketches, so this head of, who is it, Mary Magdalene, the woman taken in adultery,
Yes,
not
yes.
Mary Magdalene. In Detroit, which is this pie, is an oil study for a head in the National Gallery, which is that high. And, if you look at the quality of the thing, if that were offered to the Met for $100,000, I'd strongly recommend not getting involved with the picture. There are these impulses, which are very valid on the one hand. You with the children, that you pick out your own. Me with my dog out the window, I could pick him out of 12 of the same breed. And this is the discussion in that book by Malcolm Gladwell, Blink, which begins with an issue of
The Getty Kouros.
Connoisseurship, and is a very interesting case. And I think that more than he would ever admit, Ernst operates that way. Yes. But then he cloaks it all in this layers of description, history, scientific analysis. I suppose that so that we'll all believe it. But to me, the most striking thing about his work lately is that he keeps picking minor pictures to elevate, and he'll never take on the big ones, or the last 20 years of Rembrandt's career.
The last 20 years.
Why is that?
Yeah, the last 20 years of Rembrandt's career will be covered in Volume 6 of the
corpus.
Little
synopses.
In little synopses.
Yeah.
I think you're right that Ernst is actually a connoisseur of the old school, in that he arrives at a visual judgment and then brings in the evidence to support it.
Yeah.
And that I think is the case with the Rotterdam picture.
But
that,
to read the
that we looked at.
corpus, you'd think that was inverted, but it's not true.
But I think you're absolutely right about that. What I was drawing attention to was his power of language, which whether it's actually correct or incorrect in terms of the final result it achieves is still potent. And I think ekphrastically he's an extraordinary writer, and that is impressive. But for many of the cases that we're looking at, we don't know what the answer is.
If I could say, the issue is not whether he's a writer or not.
Yeah.
It's about appreciation and articulating
Yeah.
quality. And the one place he really sings and does that is Rembrandt the painter at work,
Yes.
because it's about Rembrandt working, and that he really understands. But when it's the finer questions of, is this a Rembrandt or
Yes.
not, I don't think Ernst really is able to distinguish well the 40 other guys who worked around Rembrandt. He's not that interested. It's the impulses of Rembrandt or not.
For sheer ekphrasis of the highest quality, Walters referred to Ernst van der Wettering's book, Rembrandt the Painter at Work. There's a chapter at the end called An Epilogue on Quality. And if you want to read literature of the highest quality about what it's like to be a painter at work, that is astonishing. But the final argument about connoisseurship, and this is something that we have to grasp, is that there is a right answer. Somebody painted this particular picture. And we have just got to work our way through the arguments and try and end up arguing the right way. It's not often...
Could I add one thing?
Yes.
To that? I sort of think that the end of that process should be, in fact, greater appreciation rather than who did it. And I suspect you feel that.
I do feel that. And I think you're right that actually the volume 6, when it comes out next year, will be a place marker. It'll be a statement of a point in time, but then Volker Manut's book will come out a year later, and it will be a different statement. But the idea that connoisseurship is aiming towards a truth, but we may not actually be able to get there, is, I think, of endless fascination. And the arguments, the ekphrasis, the technical ekphrasis that we use in order to try and illuminate it, in order to try and arrive at this truth, is just endlessly fascinating.
Well, let me end with one question, since David, you used the phrase old school connoisseurship. Can you send us off into the night, perhaps Carlo, you might want to chime in on this also, with a description of what new school connoisseurship might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. New school connoisseurship is old school connoisseurship with technology. And we are quite simply, much of the language is the same. We're still looking at the same works of art. We're still looking at their surfaces and their conceptions and their fall of light and shade and the use of shadow and the use of brushwork. But we're backing it up with new technology which sometimes confirms our suspicions, sometimes has absolutely no relevance to our suspicions, but gives us new perspectives on what we're looking at. So actually, the questions we're asking now as connoisseurs using technical art history are exactly the same as the questions that old school connoisseurs were asking a century ago. Sorry, but that's the way it is.
So technology is not the final word, which is good news. There is a tension sometimes, there is a sort of interaction, a dialogue. Yeah, I think that this makes sense. This makes sense for philology as well. In other words, we can use X-rays in order to check a papyrus, but technology must be interpreted. So we are looking for truth, and truth is related to a human world. So it's we may be absolutely committed to it, but it's obviously revocable.
Truth in the human world is a good place for us to pause now, the first of these conversations about conservation, very much in the spirit of the cultures of conservation. I thank all of you for coming tonight, all of you watching somewhere else, and most of all to our speakers for such a stirring and provocative presentation.
Thank you.